spend our summers up there. And I just fell in love with climbing and adventuring in the mountains and wilderness backpacking. I've always had an interest in history. And anytime we could go to an old museum or see war memorials, I was fascinated by that. And then I had my own business for years in Colorado, and then I moved out here in the early 80s. And as I had time, I took some mountaineering classes at the Colorado Outward Bound School, which is one of the most famous climbing schools and survival schools in the world. And I decided I was going to start climbing internationally. And my first climbing expedition was in Nepal. And I was so fascinated by Asia and just the size of the mountains, they were immense. And a friend of mine said, well, you know, Clay, there's a lot of unexplored mountains in northern India and Tibet. So I started climbing on my own, and it was back in the late 90s, I started climbing up in Tibet. And in 2002, I decided I was going to climb a mountain called Recoveries. This is Burma right here. Burma is a diamond-shaped country. And at 19,300 foot, Recoveries is the highest peak in all of Southeast Asia. And Burma is considered part of Southeast Asia. So I was determined to climb this peak. And it took 2 weeks of trekking from the nearest road just to get to the base of the mountain. And it was a very difficult mountain to climb. But while I was up there on Recoveries, in camp one day, I think it was at base camp, my orders, who were all Kachin tribesmen, were talking in a very animated manner. And of course, I couldn't understand a word of what they were saying, but then my interpreter came over and he said, Clay, they're talking about something that might be of interest to you. I'm thinking, wow, what the heck could that be? Well, anyway, he said, they're talking about an old plane crash, maybe from World War II. And this place was so remote, it took weeks to get there. No bridges, no villages, nothing. Plane, what kind of a plane? Why would we be up here? So anyway, he told me about it. And after I finished climbing Recoveries, we went down to a village, we resupplied, and we went up to the crash site. And that crash site was this one right here. And this was a C-47, and I was able to get some ID plates off of it. And it turned out that this plane had crashed while flying the Hump. At the time, I didn't even know what the Hump was. But when the Japanese occupied all the coastal regions and ports of China during the early years of World War II, the Allies set up bases in the Assam Valley. This is, here's the international border, but this is the Assam Valley of India, and the British had colonized this a couple hundred years previous. They're big tea plantations. And when the war started, the Americans built air bases. You know, it was little blue circles with a line. That's that air base. So we were flying supplies off these air bases in the Assam Valley. This is the Brahmaputra River, and it begins up here in Tibet. So we were flying supplies from air bases out of northeastern India, across northern Burma, and into China. Oftentimes they went to Kunming right here, but sometimes they went to Chongqing, which was the wartime capital. But either way, we were supplying the nationalist Chinese in their battle against the Japanese, who had occupied the ports, so nothing could come in by sea anymore. So it was actually the biggest airlift in human history, far bigger than the Berlin air. People just don't know about it. And during the many years of this airlift, over 600 planes went down, over 600 aircraft went down, and well over 2,000 American airmen and passengers were lost. There were generally very few passengers, these are the cargo aircraft, but over 2,000 U.S. troops were lost, and over 600 aircraft were lost. And see these mountain ranges, these are the Himalayas, but the Himalayas back here in Nepal and Bhutan are running east and west. And then as they come across into Tibet, they get all jumbled up, and that's because of tectonic plates. And then they dive south. This is China right here, and this is Burma. They dive south all the way down to the Bay of Bengal. So this ridge of north-south mountains is why it was known as the Hump, because they had to up and over this. But the winds were treacherous, and the winds oftentimes came up out of the southwest. Well, what's down here is the sea, Bay of Bengal. And when those warm, moist airs come up out of the come up out of the southwest, it hits these massive mountains. It creates icing and turbulence. So the most extreme icing and turbulence ever recorded on planet Earth is in this area known as the Hump. So anyway, I went to that wreck. I tried to lose some ID plates, and I went to the U.S. Embassy in Rangoon, which would be down here. And I got in there, and I was able to talk with the defense attaché, who was a hardcore Marine colonel. This guy was a character, and he had an Air Force major as a sidekick. And I told him, I showed him the ID plates, and I showed him on a map approximately where I found it. He said, "My God, well, you found one of the hump aircraft." Of course, I hadn't heard of the hump, so he educated me about that. And he said, "Oh man, you've got to go back. You've got to get GPS footage. We've got to do a full excavation." And they were just so impressed that one of these aircraft was found. So that got me on it because I like a challenge. If it's easy, I'm not interested in doing it. Call somebody else. But if no one wants to do it, I'll do it. So I would come back every year thereafter and find more and more of these aircraft. Each of these red dots symbolizes a discovery, and even one over here by Kunming. But these aircraft discoveries have resulted in a lot of very successful recoveries of remains, repatriations of the remains to the families. A lot of closure has brought about. And typically these sites are classified as non-recoverable. In other words, impossible. Don't even try. You're wasting your time. And that's because the terrain is so bad. And if you're down at a lower elevation in a forested area, then there's a high probability that the animals have scavenged all the remains over the decades. Porcupines, pigs, they'll consume everything. There won't be anything left. But at least we can identify the aircraft and where it went down and kind of solve that riddle. But I have had several very successful recoveries. And a recovery like I indicated is when you go in and you spend time on site and you excavate it. You use hardware claw screens and you try to recover remains or anything you can that might identify the airmen. Sometimes it's a dog tag. So with that, I'd like to show a slideshow. And this is a show. It is about a very famous B-25 who was known as Blackie's Gang. And it was called Blackie's Gang because the pilot was an outdoors young man. He was always outside swimming and hiking. He just got dark. He was a white guy, but he got really dark. So all of his buddies poked fun at him and called him Blackie. And because he was the captain of the aircraft, so they called it Blackie's Gang. And this guy was an ace pilot. He would take that B-25 and he'd fly down low in his valleys and he'd look for crashed American airmen. So he was an expert at leading search and rescue operations. Well, anyway, one day, a number of Japanese Zeros found him, they ganged up on him, and they shot him down. And the families have been wondering for years what happened to the aircraft. And when I go in looking for sites, sometimes I have advanced information from the families. You know, they think it's here, they think it's there, but actually, they really have no clue where it's at. How I find these aircraft is I talk to my local people, and I'll point out on a map. And believe me, when they look at a map like this, they're just puzzled. They're looking upside down, they don't know what to do. But I try to explain, well, here's the town where we're at, here's this river and that river. Are you aware of any wrecks up here? And then they all start jabbering amongst themselves, and little by little information comes out. So anyway, that particular year, I think I found this wreck in 2010. And how I found the wreck, well, it's by talking to people. They say, "Oh yeah, back up here, there's a wreck." They oftentimes call these helicopters. But of course, there were no helicopters operating in CBI theater. Helicopters were just a new invention during World War II. But when I reached the site, I actually found a dog tag of one of the gunners. So if you can find a dog tag, that's extremely rare, but that helps to identify the aircraft instantly, just like that. Because then you can enter his name in a database that pulls up the date he was lost, when, where, how, the aircraft, you get everything just within the name. So that dog tag is how we solve this case. So anyway, the family asked me to go back and recover the site. I said, what about the government? They've got an agency called Defense POW Accounting Agency, and they specialize in recovering these sites. And that particular B-25 is right in here. And this is an area that's populated by a lot of armed rebel groups. The biggest one is the Kachin Independence Army that is trying to establish a homeland for themselves in northern Burma. There's also Maoist groups on the India side of the border. These Maoist groups are always fighting with the Indian government. So between the Maoist revolutionaries and the Kachin Independence Army, this is a hotbed of armed guerrillas in there. So our government says, no way, we're not going in. It's too dangerous. We don't want any of our people taken hostage and have to go through all that. So the family came back to me. I said I would do it. I put together a budget. We eventually raised the money, and I went back. And this is the first slide in that sequence. When I reached the site, we were on a ridge, dense forest, and my lead guide, this man right here, said, well, the wreck is down in that ravine. And the forest was so jungle, you couldn't even climb in that ravine. You almost had to use a chainsaw. Well, we get down in there, and sure enough, there's the wreckage of a B-25. And very few of those B-25 operate in this theater. And rummaging around the wreck is where I found the dog tag. So we identified it. The government refused to go in, and I put together a budget, and then I went back. And in 2019, I went back with the sole purpose of excavating and recovering the site. By recovering, that means we do our best to find human remains, any remnants, personal artifacts. That's called a recovery. My local people are animists. They worship nature. So before we went down the ravine to start our work, he had a ceremony here. They put some candles in this little rock ledge, and he said prayers in Hindi, basically asking the spirits, nature, to grant us good favor and for no one to be injured or be struck by a venomous snake. The area has the highest death rate in the world from snake bite. There's a number of cobras, crates, and the most dangerous is one called the Russell's viper. It kills more people than cobras and crates. Matter of fact, over 30,000 people every year die of snake bite in India. Over 30,000. Here in the United States, take a guess what it is.
10.
Under 10.
Under 10.
Under 10, maybe 4 or 5. There it's 30,000. So anyway, you have to be very careful where you put every hand, every foot. So we had this ceremony to get the spirits on our side and bless the event. And then we went down in the ravine and we started excavating. Here we are, we're lined up in the ravine. We start at the very bottom and we work our way up. Wreckage, large pieces of wreckage are examined for any numbers, and those numbers are recorded. And then we just start with these garden tools, and in a line like that, we excavate as well as we can, basically down the hard-packed soil. This is a ravine, so obviously water's flowed down through here over the decades. And if we can find any remains, those remains and the dirt that's in will be run through a shaker screen and a hardwood pump. Next.
Question for you?
Yes.
Because of the density of the vegetation, was the debris field relatively tight?
Yes, it was. It was very tight.
Yeah.
It was all in this narrow ravine, but it was all overgrown. So it took quite a bit of work to clear the vegetation. But here again, you start at the bottom and you work your way up. So everything, and all the vegetation that we clear, all the dirt we sifted, everything just gets dumped below us, and we just continually move up gradient. And that's really the only way to operate in a steep terrain like that. Next. And that's me on the site, examining some of the wreckage. Look at the size of these leaves, huge leaves on some of these jungle trees. And it actually gets, you can see the clothing, it actually gets kind of cold there. So you had to have a good selection of clothes. Next. This is actually the escape hatch that goes in the fuselage ceiling directly above the cockpit area. How many modern day men climb out of that little opening? There were 2 of them, one over the pilot's seat and one over the pilot. That was the escape hatch over that hatch.